Well, hello. Presumably, you can read the title. If not, I don't know how much utility you're gonna get out of this book recommendation video. The point is, I won't waste your time with a long introduction, but I will take the time to disclaim that I've only really ever read 8 vampire novels, so this video might not be as comprehensive as would be ideal, but I've just been reading a lot recently, and I'm excited to tell you guys which ones I would recommend avoiding and which ones I would recommend sinking your teeth into. Be prepared for more of those. You've been forewarned. So I'm gonna start this video with the worst, and then I'm gonna work my way up to the best, because otherwise I would end this video horribly depressed. So coming in hot, or cold more accurately, in a tie for last place, I gave this book 1 star on Goodreads. It is Crave by Tracy Wolff. Crave is a book about a teenage girl whose parents die under mysterious circumstances. God forbid our YA protagonist have parents, and she gets sent away to this boarding school in Alaska because her uncle is headmaster or something, and the school is full of all sorts of magical creatures. Genuinely, nothing happens in this book. I was expecting mystery, action, drama, or, just some semblance of a plot, but that was really on me, guys. I set my expectations far too high. Crave is the first book in a series, a big series too. I think there's 7 books in the series, and I've heard that the plot really ramps up, or vamps up, if you will, in the 2nd and 3rd installments. Sorry, that's the worst one in here. So it's great that the plot starts getting more interesting, but I think that's kind of silly that a reader should have to suffer through a bad first book in order to get to the enjoyable parts of the series. Crave feels very much like setup, and I wish that Tracy Wolff had just found a way to condense all of that setup into a few chapters and put it at the beginning of her apparently superior 2nd novel. The worst part of the book, though, isn't the annoying main character or the world building or even the most unlovable love interest ever. It's just the writing. I don't think Tracy Wolff is a bad writer, but I do think she made a choice in the narrative tone of this book, and I don't think it was a good choice. The narration reads very much like a middle-aged woman trying to impersonate a teenager, complete with acronyms like AF and FML on like every other page. Even without the weird teen speak, I just thought the writing was kind of weird. Let me give you an example, a little taste. This paragraph takes place right after Grace, who is our main character, runs into the love interest Jackson, and he's being a complete asshole to her, of course, because the kids need their enemies to lovers or whatever. Add in the thick dark hair, and there's nothing to do but give in. Nothing to do but accept that obnoxious smirk or not. This boy is sexy AF. What little oxygen I'd been able to pull into my lungs at the high altitude completely disappears with the realization, which only makes me madder, because seriously, when did I become the heroine in some YA romance? You guys get it? It's because she's the heroine in some YA romance. The wit, the irreverence. This book isn't all bad. I mean, the cover is absolutely stunning. The setting is all right, and it's a very quick read. So, I don't know. It just wasn't for me, but it might be for some people. Moving swiftly on, if any book placement on this list is going to be controversial, I feel that it's going to be this one. This book is also in last place because I think objectively, by a literary criticism standpoint, it's a better book than Crave, whatever the hell that means, but it was also way less enjoyable for me. So this book is Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons, which is an 800-page long book that, despite having an interesting premise, had one of the most boring, pretentious, soul-sucking executions I've ever seen. Oh, you're still here after I said 800 pages? Weirdo. Kidding, just kidding. The vampires in this book are mind vampires, which take over the minds of their victims, as opposed to the normal blood-drinking vampire. You might be saying, yeah, that's really cool, I guess, but what's the actual plot? And to that I would say, well, how much time do you have? You have your evil vampires playing a game based on how many minds they overtake. You have your crew of stupid humans trying to understand what's causing all of the murders around their town. Oh, and then, of course, as you do, you have your Nazi officers and Holocaust survivors who are in this for some reason. The book is set in the 80s, but it bounces back and forth to the 40s, and I don't understand the addition of the Holocaust in this sci-fi book about vampires. I'm doing a really bad job of explaining the plot of this book, but it's quite difficult for me to condense it into a short synopsis. If you try looking up plot summary of Carrion Comfort, the summary itself is like a short story. And honestly, my suggestion is to just read the summary of the book on Wikipedia instead of the actual book. I would love some psychoanalysis of Dan Simmons through this book because I could feel the ego just dripping from every page of this book. There is no doubt in my mind that this author thinks that he is God's gift to the genre, which is ironic because aside from the vampires, which were admittedly pretty cool, this book can hardly be called transgressive. The characters conform almost painfully to stereotypes, especially if you happen to be a black woman from Philly in this book. Oh my god. There's only one good stereotype in this book, and that's that Nazis equal bad. I saw some people on Goodreads saying, oh, the evil Nazi trope got so tiring. Guys, that's a good stereotype. We want that stereotype. Did you want the man to give the Nazis a redemption arc or something? Last thing I'll say about this book is that, oh my god, was there a lot of sexual assault, and oh my god, was it handled horribly. I'm not against dark subject matter in a book, but I am against the fetishization of assault. And if you're listening to me right now and you're thinking, oh, this is just some stupid Gen Z girl, people these days are so sensitive, please hear me out for a second. My favorite book of all time is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, and that book is just full of assault and violence and discrimination and all sorts of heinous things. But every one of those scenes had a purpose, and every single one was crafted to make the reader feel empathy for the victims. Because Dan Simmons made the conscious decision to explain every sexual assault scene in graphic detail from the perspective of the perpetrator, and he did this multiple times, I just have to come to the conclusion that those scenes were included to excite. Also, I don't know who needs to hear this. Actually I do, and it's Mr. Dan Simmons over here. But women do not actually live in a state of hyper-awareness about their chests. If a woman feels a very strong emotion, shockingly, her chest does not perk up or deflate to reflect that. I know it's really unfair to expect a 40-year-old man to know this, but we live and we learn, right? So yeah, I guess you could say that this book sucked. Low-hanging fruit is still fruit, okay? Hello again. No, I didn't go anywhere, but I know for a fact that at least one of you immediately skipped to the next book after hearing that Carrion Comfort was 800 pages. If that was you, know that you are seen and you are valid. Jumping from 1 star to 3, the next book on my list is Twilight. Everyone knows Twilight, and I'm not going to waste your time explaining the premise, but I will say Twilight is not nearly as bad as everyone says it is, and I'm convinced that 90% of the people who call it the worst book ever written haven't actually read a single chapter. As my best friend said when I was telling her about this video, people only really hated Twilight because it was a blueprint for YA romance, which was automatically hated with exceptional vitriol because it's a genre beloved by teenage girls. Twilight is just a fun read. It's a fast read. The atmosphere is conveyed quite well. I loved reading about the Pacific Northwest, especially as it intersected with the more gothic elements of vampirism. It's a little silly at times. I think it veers into the melodrama territory quite often. And the thing that really holds me back from saying that it's a great book as opposed to a good one is that I didn't actually really like the characters. But overall, my thing about Twilight is that it's one of those rare cases in which the movie is a lot better than the book. And I think that's because the biggest draw of the franchise is its aesthetic, and that can just be conveyed so much more powerfully through a visual medium like a movie as opposed to a literary media. So if you watched the movie and you didn't like it, obviously don't bother with this book. If you saw the movie and loved it, I assume you've already read the book, but do so if you haven't. And if you haven't seen the movie, but you're in the mood for something fast, fun, and even at times a very sweet romance, then definitely check this one out. In 4th place with 3.5 stars, I have Carmilla, the OG vampire novel. Yes, even before Dracula. Carmilla is an 1872 Gothic novella by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. And get this, it's only 108 pages. And get this also, the vampire is a lesbian. And it's not even depicted as weird. The vampirism is seen as the abnormality, I guess. Never once is anyone like, two women being attracted to each other. Like, what an unholy temptation, you know? So it's really nice, especially for such an old book. Carmilla is told mostly from the perspective of a young woman named Laura, who lives with her father in this gorgeous castle in the forest. Through some strange circumstances, her father comes to be the caretaker of a woman about Laura's age, who is named Carmilla. Carmilla and Laura instantly become infatuated with one another, but Carmilla starts behaving very strangely, especially at night, and at the same time, girls and young women in Laura's town, who used to be completely healthy, suddenly start dying. You can listen to this book for free on Audible, not sponsored. God, I wish. But the audio book is quite good. I really liked how they added all of the sounds in the background to make everything feel more immersive. There is kind of a lot of heavy breathing in this book. Camilla and Laura have some spicy scenes, never anything that actually veers into like sexually explicit territory, but Carmilla says the most out-of-pocket things to Laura. If they lived in 2022 and Carmilla wasn't a vampire, they definitely would have moved in within 2 days of knowing each other. So, pros of Carmilla. It's short, so you can read it in a few hours and then be like, hey, I just read a classic. The writing is lovely. Also, the female characters had a lot of depth. Laura and her father have this really wholesome, lovely, familial relationship. And finally, I really liked the ensemble cast. There's this traveling merchant who's only there for like 2 pages, but he was my favorite character. He comes to Laura's castle trying to sell something, and the dialogue in that scene is so funny, especially the way the voice actor read it in the audiobook. So if it has all of these pros, why is it only 3.5 stars? Well, for being so short, this book actually had a lot of repetition and exposition. I thought the ending was also quite abrupt, and I actually thought it could have been a tiny bit longer. I know, I never thought I would say that. Just like 50 more pages to kind of flesh out the world and the story, so that things don't feel quite so isolated. But otherwise, we're at the point in my list where I can start saying that these books are good. Read Carmilla, it's a great reading experience, and if you hate it, it's only an hour or 2 out of your life. Number 5, also at 3.5 stars, is Let the Right One In by... do I attempt to pronounce the Swedish name, or do I just put it up here so that no one can make fun of my accent? This book is the first of 2 on this list that I have a very complicated relationship with. When it comes to my personal enjoyment of this book, I didn't actually like it very much. This is an extremely bleak book featuring huge content warning, a lot of graphic things involving children. Actually, I'll just give you the full list of content warnings. Alcoholism, bullying, mutilation, acid, the chemical, not the drug, existential dread, murder, and probably the worst one for a lot of people is the abuse of a minor. Am I selling this book or what? Don't worry though, I'm not recommending you some sketchy, like gore erotica. This is a critically acclaimed bestseller, and I think the reason that a lot of people were willing to put up with all of this graphic content is that the story of the book is actually incredibly meaningful. It's a story about evil versus innocence, and these scenes, although they were difficult, all felt very purposeful. Unlike Carrion Comfort, there was no sense of flippancy at all in dealing with these topics when they came up. This book is set in 1981 in Stockholm. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Oscar who is being horrifically bullied in school. He meets this mysterious girl named Ellie, whom he learns is a vampire, and the book is about their friendship and them trying to support one another and learn about one another despite their very difficult and very different situations. Here's what I suggest. Let the Right One In has 2 film adaptations. It has a Swedish one with the exact same name, and it has an American one that's just called Let Me In. The Swedish film I loved. It kind of toned down a lot of the most graphic parts of the story, especially when it came to the assault of children, but doing so didn't detract at all from the plot of the book. In fact, I think it made it a lot better. So if you think what I just described with the book was too much, but you're still interested, then try the movie. You could also watch the American remake, but don't watch the American remake. It's just very... It's very American. You get what I'm saying. Okay, now we're getting to the cream of the crop. It is the OG Dracula by Bram Stoker. Carmilla might have been the original vampire novel, but Dracula is It's the quintessential vampire novel. The book opens with a solicitor named Jonathan Harker, who is traveling across Transylvania to help his client, the Count Dracula, purchase a house. Eventually, Jonathan discovers what Dracula is and escapes from his vampire brides, who are such a cool component of this book. In the meantime, Dracula moves to England to terrorize this little seaside town. Bad move on his part, though, because the man, the myth, the legend, Professor Abraham Van Helsing is there, and he's ready to fight this monstrosity and take back his city. This book is so fun, y'all. The first part is very gothic and creepy, and the end is so action-packed and badass. This book, as with many vampire books, is very transgressive when it comes to sexuality. Dracula, who is obviously male, is the sensual, dangerous, seductress figure of the novel. And I'm just now realizing that seductress is specifically a female gendered term, and I can't think of any male equivalent. Seducer, but that's kind of gender neutral. Shows how ingrained these things are into our culture and our language. Anyway, Bram Stoker just does a lot of really interesting things with sex and sexuality, although not so much with gender. I've read some critical essays in which Stoker is praised for how he handles his female characters, and I've read some in which he is criticized for it. I would say the latter tend to be a lot more convincing. There's some really overt sexism in this book, and there's also only 2 named female characters, and I think they both fit pretty neatly into stereotypes. I definitely enjoyed this book in spite of its handling of the female characters, and not because of it. It doesn't even pass the Bechdel test, I don't think, unless you count a passing reference to a conversation in a letter. And if you think I'm being harsh, Sheridan Le Fanu had no problem writing multifaceted female characters who had a compelling relationship with one another in his book, which is older. So, however, I think the fact that I managed to enjoy this novel so thoroughly despite this is a huge testament to just how well written it is. There's a lot to unravel, the action is amazing, Dracula's vampire brides are super interesting, and I wish we'd seen more of them. This book is a classic for a reason, and that's why I gave it 4 stars. Okay. The next book on this list I enjoyed, but I just can't give it a star rating. This book is Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright. If you're familiar with that author, you understand why I'm hesitant to give it a star rating. If you like 80s horror movies and you're okay with a lot of gore, sex, and angsty goths and eyeliner, then you'll love this book. I gotta warn you though, this book is high on the list, but it has trigger warnings up the wazoo. Here are all the ones just that come to my mind. I didn't even write these down. Incest, very explicit sex, sexual assault, so many drugs, so much gore, child abduction, child death, domestic abuse, maternal mortality. There are more, I can't think of them right now. So yeah, 3 of the books on this list with major content warnings. But this book is unlike the others because it's so campy and over the top that it didn't make me miserable like Let the Right One In did, but it also didn't make me angry, or as angry as Carrion Comfort did. Also, the characters really felt like actual characters and not little toys that the author was just playing with to see how much torture they could cram into a book. The only thing I just couldn't get behind was the amount of incest in this book. There were 2 no, oh my god, there were 3 incestuous relationships in this book, and I was like, dude, one is already too much. 2 of these relationships are between vampires, and it was presented as well, their race is so few, and yes, it's taboo, but at least they're finding comfort in one another. Jail. Lost Souls is about a group of vampires and a group of humans who all wind up in this little town in North Carolina, and kind of the chaos that ensues from their paths crossing. There's a trio of cruel and hedonistic vampires. There's a 15-year-old vampire named Nothing who runs away from his adoptive parents to try to find himself. There's Ghost, I love Ghost, who is a human boy struggling with his psychic powers, and his best friend Steve, who is a human boy struggling with being a massive dickhead, and the 2 of them make up a band called Lost Souls. All of these characters' paths intersect in really interesting ways, and I guess I'd say the book is more of a really depressing, kind of zany, but often very poignant character study / coming of age novel more than anything else. Every single character in this book was horrible, and I loved that. I love it when authors aren't afraid to write about horrible people. There is one kind of faint light in the darkness of this book in the character Ghost, who, unlike everyone else in this grim novel, is this compassionate, gold-hearted boy who just wants to save his friends, often from themselves. And without him, I don't think I would have enjoyed this book as much as I did, but the choice of having this kind of lifeline to hope in this book was a really, really smart decision. Did I think this book was over the top with shock factor sometimes? Yes, even though this book is more graphic than Let the Right One In. Let the Right One In is 100% more disturbing because it's a much more serious story. Lost Souls is gruesome in an 80s slasher film way, whereas the other book is gruesome in like a World War II movie kind of way. But I think there's something really kind of special about this book if and only if you are in the headspace to deal with the heavy subject matter used to convey its messages about love and life and individuality. If you think you can though, please check out this book. It's kind of a huge guilty pleasure book for me, and I really enjoyed it even though it was very, very heavy. Alright, girl bosses, gender neutral, we've made it. My favorite vampire book, and one of my favorite books ever, is this delicacy of a book called A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is a book about a young woman who's on the brink of death but is reborn as a vampire when this mysterious figure, who is never named but is implied to be Dracula, saves her by feeding her his blood. This book starts off like a fantastical gothic romance. The Dracula character is so hot and romantic, but here's the cool thing. The honeymoon period ends very quickly. You, along with the main character, whose name is Constanza, start to notice little things are off. Maybe little flashes of anger, maybe some inappropriate behaviors. But mostly you really love the Dracula figure, and you can kind of excuse his behavior because he did save the main character after all, and they seem so in love. Eventually other characters are pulled into this relationship. There's an extremely intelligent noblewoman named Magdalena, my favorite character, and a beautiful young artist named Alexei, both of whom are kind of courted and brought into this suddenly polyamorous relationship without Constanza's real consent. And so you hate these characters at first, but then you kind of watch them suffer and lose themselves along with Constanza as the relationship starts to turn abusive. And so you start to fall in love with them and want nothing more than the three of them to come together and escape. So obviously, if you couldn't tell by the synopsis, this is a story about domestic abuse, and it is executed so well. The vampire aspect plays into this really well because certain characteristics of vampirism are used to reinforce certain aspects of the abusive relationship. For example, vampires are very much others to the human population because they can't so easily live among them. And the Dracula character uses this to isolate his husband and wives and to kind of concert his control over them, which of course is something that is often done to victims in a domestic abuse situation. It's kind of heavy, but it's very hopeful. It's just written so well in a way that you kind of feel like you're also in the relationship and you're also kind of struggling with this push and pull feeling with Dracula, because sometimes you love him, sometimes you really hate him. I think this is a really special book, and I hope that if you guys read any vampire book on this list, it's this one. It's very unique, it's very powerful, and I cannot praise S.T. Gibson enough for it. Okay, I've been talking for a long time, and that is my ranking. The next vampire books I want to read are anything Anne Rice related, because I just gotta know if the hype is warranted, and also Fledgling by Octavia Butler, because come on, it's Octavia Butler. If I haven't read all of her books before I die, I'll be very disappointed in myself. Feel free to leave your vampy recs in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Happy early Halloween, and thanks for watching.